There. Now you should be hearing me. Okay, good. There. Okay, awesome. Now you should be hearing me. All right, you Twitch. Perfect. Okay, so, as you can see, I'm styling in my Croatia jersey. I have not yet watched the end of the game, so please don't tell me if the 1-0 lead holds. Let's see. I think this is going to end on a really good. Yeah, it is perfect. So I'm going to read 4 and 5 today. Should not be that long. If there are questions, I will answer them at the end. To recap what occurred, yeah, it's about a 20-page section, so it should not be that lengthy. And it ends beautifully on a cliffhanger, actually, so this is great. Okay, so the quick recap of what happened so far is that Trem is helping Jovan to try to find his father. They have headed toward the town of Guylakil, which was Jovan's original destination, and they will be, once having arrived there, looking for information related to Jovan's father. So, I'll start from there. There's not really a lot else to recap except for the fact that they left Trem's house primarily because he was advised, if that's the right word, to leave by Garrett Oakhart's spirit. That's a lot of S's. From a soul tree, and he was then advised further by Curvin, the god of time, who is the god responsible for Trem's agelessness, and as such, he decided that, partially based on their advice and partially based on his own desire, that he was going to leave. So, my jersey doesn't fit right. Chapter 4. Trem and Jovan reached Guylakil shortly before nightfall after 4 full days of travel across the plains. The brisk pace set by Trem had continued unabated, despite his recognition that Jovanaleth was struggling to keep up. In Trem's mind, time was of the essence, and his companion did not complain or ask him to slow his progress, so Trem did not. Nor would Trem check on him. He merely kept them both fed and made sure they were able to camp in sheltered and relatively safe areas during their journey. Trem allowed no fires during the long march, and he was rewarded by the two having no encounters with anyone, traveler or bandit, on the worn and fading road. There was a distinct mood to the town as soon as they reached the outskirts. The sprawl of desperate people outside the walls was visible from afar, and when they were still some distance off, Jovan remarked that it looked like there were ants crawling around the base of the city walls. Trem made no response, instead keeping his mind focused singularly on their purpose for coming here. As they came close enough to distinguish the individual people all around the palisade, he glued his eyes to the gates, trying to avoid any acknowledgement of the desperate situation about him. Jovanaleth was quite the opposite. He took in the ragged crowds of hopeless and exhausted faces, scanning the entirety of their number as they approached and made their way to the main gate. It was clear many of the refugees were without food, or at least had very small amounts of it, but they made no attempts to beg or plead coins or supplies from the two travelers. Their walk up the road was unimpeded. In fact, many stepped aside to allow them through. To Jovan, it was clear this was a great mass of defeated people, not those who had fight left in them, and were going to seek aid from passerby. He also noted, among the worn family frames of makeshift tents and camps, bloody rags and grievous wounds. War had come to the Dust Plains, and these people were merely its harbinger. Trem and Jovan reached the gate, looming high and sturdy before them. 4 guards stood outside the entrance they came upon, thoroughly eyeing both of them, but not asking any questions. Above them, Trem could see several archers, keeping a sharp eye on the newcomers. Those outside gripped their pikes and watched them tensely, clearly aware of their responsibility, but uncomfortable with it at the same time. Trem slowed his approach, and they halted a safe distance from the guards. They pushed one of their number forward, and he attempted to assume an air of authority. "What business do you have at Guylakil?" "We're seeking the whereabouts of a man we believe passed through here," Trem answered. "Do you have coin? We can take no more within our walls who cannot pay." "Some." Trem pulled a small pouch from his belt and held it up so the guards could see. "Enough for a room for a night or 2. This seemed to satisfy the guards, and they motioned for the gates to be opened. Jovan had expected questions about their weaponry, for the two were heavily armed for simple travelers, but in truth, the presence of more fighting men and women in the city was looked at as favorable by most. Violence in the streets was clearly not the concern. What lurked beyond the walls was the real source of their fear. The great doors of the palisade swung open, and the two walked in, the town of Guayaquil stretching out before them. The guards watched until the pair turned a corner off the main road, trying to find a street not packed tight with the bodies of refugees in meager shelters. The town itself was a cluster of thatched roofs supported by solid wooden or mud brick houses. These uniform structures dominated the majority of the town, but a slightly larger building with a smoke hole in the hut top and the rhythmic clanging of hammers clearly stood out as the blacksmith, some distance in the east if Trem had to make a guess. The eeriness of the sounds of the streets was unnerving. Children from the town were not darting about playing at being heroes or engaged in games of tag. In fact, the few that were out were under careful eyes of concerned mothers who would not let them stray too far due to the other occupants on the roads. Being about dusk, the streets were still relatively full of the most run-down people Trem had ever seen. Most of them were humans and halflings, smaller and stockier humanoids who were fond of farming in the countryside. But all of these people, regardless of race, appeared to be those who had retreated from destroyed villages to the east, to find someplace safer than where they had come from. A few true elves dotted the street's sides too, but they were heavily outnumbered by the others sitting forlornly beside them. Those elves that were there looked to be dead already, with sunken eyes and distressed faces, their halfling and human counterparts not much better off. Trem expected at least some of them to beg for coins or other help, but like their fellow refugees beyond the walls, they just sat as though defeated. Perhaps he admitted they really were. The crowd continued to stare beyond he and Joven as they passed by. Travelers clearly no longer brought much notice, even unique ones. Their beaten appearance kept Trem focused on the hundreds of refugees, despite all his efforts to ignore the dire situation. Trem could not make his eyes turn away, but Joven tugged at his sleeve and pulling him out of his thoughts. "There's the inn. I bet that's the best place to find rumor of a traveler." Trem nodded, murmuring, "There are a lot of travelers, only it seems some have nowhere to go." Joven looked at Trem sadly. Clearly the scene on the street disturbed Jovanaleth as well, but he knew there was nothing to be done. Trem watched a woman come out of the inn and hand loaves of bread to the people on the street. There wasn't enough for even a quarter of the people there, and a few scattered fights broke out. He spotted two children, little over 7 years old, flailing and striking at each other to steal just a scrap more of food. Leaving Joven's side, he walked them and took the piece of bread they were fighting over, holding it away above their heads, while they watched angrily, knowing they could do nothing. Trem smiled as disarmingly as he could manage. "This is not worth fighting over. If I split it between you, and then you both will have something to eat. You can take this, too." He pulled some dried meat from his pack and gave one piece to each. The boys stared wide-eyed at meat they had probably not tasted for months, and then, as though they feared that he might rethink his generosity, they ran swiftly away from him. Trem watched them for a while, and then shook his head to clear his thoughts. He felt rather foolish for his charity in that moment. Trying to shake off his conflicting emotions, he walked over to Jovanaleth. His companion patted him on the shoulder, remarking, "For a loner, you seem to get along with people well." "It was a foolish decision. We'll need those supplies as well." Joven was somewhat taken aback by Trem's hard tone. "Starving children can have my share any day. I would not call your actions foolish." Trem did not reply, still a bit out of sorts, and followed him to the inn door. The building was large and rambling with 3 above-ground levels. The base of it was clearly the common room. Trem could hear minstrels singing the grand ballad of Bullwife Margrave and the War of the Lion. He paused before entering the main room, and Joven looked back questioningly. Trem swallowed and said, "Get us a table and a room. I need to take a walk." Joven seemed to hesitate, and Trem tried to reassure him. "Don't worry, I will not be long." Joven decided even should he want to, he could not convince Trem to come in now. Besides, he thought, there was very little trouble Trem could get into that he could not get out of in this place. The hermit, despite his youth and inexperience, had a deadly walk, one that appeared trained into him, and something he would never shake off. Joven nodded and said, "All right, but don't be too long. Some of these people are more desperate than they look, and do not get lost." Trem solemnly turned and started off down the main road at a brisk pace, away from the larger crowds of refugees. Jovanaleth hesitated, wondering if he ought to follow, and chose against it. Trem wanted to be alone, and Joven decided he should respect that. Thinking that this was probably the best thing he could do, Jovanaleth entered the inn, and was immediately swallowed up in the noise and a rush of dim light. Trem felt guilty about abandoning Joven at the inn, but the story he had heard coming through the door, one he knew better than any bard, had driven the old fear back into him. Moving quickly away from the refugees, he pushed between the homes of Guayaquil's citizens, looking for some place to rest and collect his thoughts. Almost without thinking, he walked through an open doorway to a small granite building and pressed against the wall within, letting out a great sigh. Feeling somewhat better, Trem looked around it with a sense of trepidation that came over him. He was in the temple to one of Tethanir's many gods, though Trem could not say which from the few plain trappings all about him. His wariness for the immortals was overcome by a sudden twinge of curiosity as he spotted the small pedestal at the center of the tiny building. Walking towards it, he realized it held an hourglass with a slowly filling base at its center. Leaning in for a closer look, Trem was caught off guard when the sound echoed in his mind. "I would appreciate it if you did not touch that, Trem Waterhound." Straightening in surprise, Trem looked about him and, seeing nothing, turned to the hourglass again. Realization dawned on him and he knelt closer once more. Curvin, I should have recognized your symbol. Perhaps, though I will not hold your forgetfulness against you. There was a pause before the voice continued. So you chose to leave. Yes, and I'm not certain I'm happy with my decision. Trem glanced about him as though suddenly reconsidering the encounter. I ought to get back to Jovanaleth. Trem made as though to leave, but the voice echoed sternly in his mind. You must hear what I have to say, Trem. Why? Trem crossed his arms in defiance. Nothing a god has ever deigned to tell me, in waking or in dreams, has ever led to anything good, even you, god of time. Curvin spoke steadily. I pressed you to leave your exile, and I wish to repay you for your decision, though you may not see my gesture as a kindness. Tell me, why did you give up trying to find your mother? My mother? Trem whispered. What does it matter? I do not want to know how to answer the question. She left me when I was an infant. I suppose I simply decided I no longer cared. A lie, Curvin said matter-of-factly. I can understand leaving Aves, abandoning the knights, and their inexplicable disgust for your elven heritage, but I presumed you would take up your old quest. There was a pause, and Trem sensed Curvin was coming to the point of his rambling. Besides, your mother had no choice in leaving you. To fulfill my duty, I had to make her give you away. Your duty? Trem's wrath began to overtake him. What possible benefit could there be to making a mother surrender her child to strangers? You do not know your mother. Trem turned as he sensed movement in the room. The hourglass rose slowly from the pedestal and began to rotate. She was an angry young woman, Trem. Moreover, you were not something she had planned on. Her people had been destroyed by the rash influences of immortals upon mortals, and the surge of power beyond even the reckoning of we gods. She wanted revenge, and asked me to grant her and my servant the power to exact it. But she was not strong enough. The hourglass completed its revolution, the sand now beginning to fill the empty half as it slowly lowered back down. Your mother was not strong enough, but I could sense that you were. I agreed to give you a piece of myself that you might cease to age, and the great powers of elf and man would resonate at their strongest within you for as long as you remained alive. This was to give you power, and the time to understand and wield it with wisdom. That is why I made her surrender you to the Waterhounds. Her wrath, her lust for vengeance, it would have infested you and turned you into an instrument of her will. I wanted you to be your own person, to reach your own conclusions about the world, and your place in it. That is what I wish to give you, in exchange for your trust in my advice. I acted despite your advice, not because of it, and I want no part of the world, Trem said defiantly. In my past, I only wanted to meet the woman who gave me up and ask her why. I suppose you've given me that answer. She is very different now than she once was. I think perhaps you may meet her some day, and get the reconciliation you seek. Trem slashed the air with a dismissive hand. There's no need anymore. I'm not here for myself. Jovanaleth and his mission are my only purpose. Tell me, Trem, Curvin's voice became calmer and soothing. What makes you wish to help Jovanaleth? Is it because you lost a mother, and he seeks his father? Do you not believe the similarity of Jovan's circumstances to your own speaks to you in some way? I do, Trem replied, and perhaps that does drive me to assist him, but there's also still that sense of anger. Anger at my mother, at you, at all the gods for cursing me with this pseudo-immortality and thrusting me into a conflict I do not fathom nor care to understand. I have wondered so many times why it was done to me, why I could not be left alone to rise or fall like every other soul on Teth Tanir. Curvin did not respond at first, but Trem waited. These are fair questions, Trem, and the answers are not simple. You were chosen because you were capable of absorbing my essence. There are few in all of history who could do so. As to why you cannot rise or fall, as you put it, you still can. I admit I tried to drive you from your home, though I also believe it is what you truly wish to do, regardless of my influence in the matter. What happens to you beyond that is in your power, so do not doubt that. Trem sighed. Yet you had told me that my leaving meant a chance to prevent some cataclysm that awaits Teth Tanir. You pretend at clarity, but you talk in riddles. No riddles, Curvin continued calmly. I, more than even other gods, have dwelt ever in realms apart from the visible world. There are powers beyond our own, too utterly beyond the thought I dare not tell you more of. I say this not to speak without clarity, but because such couched language shields you from the danger of knowing what should not be known. That's a convenient excuse to speak so cryptically, Trem said, but added begrudgingly, though I believe you are trying to protect me in your own way. I am, and as unbelievable as it may seem, so too is Neroth. Yes, we gods manipulate and vie for command over our creations for selfish reasons, but all our worlds are under threat. So what do I do? Whatever you believe is right. Nothing more or less can be asked of you. Trem sensed the god was fading, leaving him behind in the temple. But what if I do not confront the troubles of the world? What if I decide to return home? That, Curvin whispered faintly as his voice slowly faded from the chamber, is always a path that shall remain open to you. A great pressure left the room, and Trem felt as though he had been released from a trance. Stepping outside, he saw that at least an hour had passed, though it had felt like no more than a few minutes. Making his way back to the Inn of the Four Winds, he stopped, standing at the center of town where the two roads intersected. Looking south, he imagined he could see Silverleaf Forest, his home. Turning his head west, he saw the inn where Joven was waiting. He hesitated a moment, remembering what Curvin had said about choices, and then with stern determination and defiance, he stepped with fierce intent to the west and opened the door of the inn. Good break. Water. It's hot. Edgewolf Elvok faced a choice of his own at that moment. He had tried to keep the tears from welling in his eyes as he crossed the main hall, emotions roiling within him. Edge could not afford to let on that he was sickened by Wolfbane's behavior or the plans that had been unearthed in the meeting. He could show no weakness until he got Wolfbane alone. Then he would loose all his pain and frustration on the man he'd trusted for so long. But at the moment he had to lose Valissa Ulfred. She had followed him after sensing his distress since the meeting, though Edge was certain she thought it for reasons other than the truth. At last she reached out a hand to halt him as he turned the corner towards his rooms. "Speak to me, young one. What troubles you so?" Edge turned slowly, taking in Valissa's attractive features, hardly concealed in a low-cut leather chest piece, complete with a dangerously short armored kilt and high hunting boots. Her seductive voice had drawn the answers she wanted out of many a man, Edge knew, usually right before she turned them over to the guards, and they spent their years wasting away in a dungeon or worse. The tears he had feared might appear moments ago went dry in an instant. He could hardly bear to speak to this insult of a woman. "It's nothing, sword mistress. I'm merely tired." She studied him with a hard eye. Valissa took a special interest in the protection of Edge, mainly because he belonged to Wolfbane, and in her eyes was one of his favorites. Edge knew this was fortunate, for refusing to answer Valissa truthfully would have earned anyone else a blade between his or her ribs. "You must not be so distressed. Wolfbane merely holds you back from the excursion to the Dust Plains so he can preserve your skills for more important duties. You are too valuable and attractive to lose conquering some meager rural settlements. And if some foolish farmer is lucky enough to hit you with a stray arrow, Wolfbane would never forgive me." She smoothed his cloak on his shoulders, pressing a bit closer than was necessary. "If you are indeed tired, then go rest, though I wonder if there might be something that could reinvigorate you." Forcing himself not to shove the despicable woman off of him, Edge managed a sickly grin. "Thank you, another time, though. I truly do not need to be any more exhausted than I already am." Valissa curled her cat-like smile and stepped back. "Very well, young warrior, get some rest then." And without another word, she brushed past him, heading for the training grounds. Edge managed to contain himself until he was in his chambers, where he tossed his chainmail tunic onto a nearby chair. He then made a sharp motion of dismissal at Lolanas, his elven servant supplied to him by Daervaron after the cruel beast had removed the man's tongue. The elf closed the door softly behind him as he left, perhaps sensing his master's mood. Removing his cloak and his cloth tunic, Edge tossed them aside and strode to the wash basin, splashing some warm water onto his face. Looking up, he saw his unusual green eyes staring back under a head of striking white hair. Dark rings around those eyes. He had not slept well again. He could not even remember the last time he had. Taking a towel, he dried his face and walked into the main room where he slumped onto his bed. Squeezing his eyes shut, he tried desperately to think. Wolfbane was mad in his conviction, and likely had been for some time. But Edge clung to the hope that every once in a while he saw the old light of sanity in the man's eyes. It had blinded Edge to the fact that even he himself was now in the service of a violent dictator. The same man who had saved Edge in the island town of Villanis from a grim specter of death and mayhem now brought those plagues on an entire nation. Edge had been raised in a temple to Narath. He and his brother left there by their own mother, who could not or would not raise them. Wolfbane had taken them in when he came to Alanis and solved the mysterious murders plaguing the town. Together the three had sworn to serve Narath in his quest to seize control of the mortal world, a mission Edge once considered noble, and for the protection of the people of Teth Tanir. Now, after such violence and bloodshed propagated in the name of safety, he knew protection was not the goal, but subjugation. Wolfbane was leading a campaign of coerced loyalty maintained by the blades of the conquerors. Edge remembered how he worshipped the great warrior. He remembered watching him practice with the immense axe that Edge could not have dreamed of even budging. He remembered seeing Wolfbane make that axe seem light as a feather when he had fought and killed the Slith, the mysterious beast that had taken forms of its victims and cast a shadow of fear over Alanis. The Slith had been the servant of Balthazane, god of betrayal, and had killed close to 30 people in his name. Before Wolfbane, none had been able to uncover the cause of the deaths. He had arrived at Alanis and swiftly become a hero, had been a defender of the small island's people and a living legend. Edge closed his eyes and sighed. He had not seen his home in several years. He wondered what they would think of Wolfbane and him now. Wolfbane had taught Edge and his brother, trained them, and enlightened them in many ways. Not merely a master of the axe, Wolfbane was skilled enough with the halberd that he was able to create a man better at it than himself, or so he had told Edge. Edge was not so sure he had surpassed Wolfbane yet. which is one reason why no weapon would be on his person when he confronted him. He realized at last that this was the one remaining option to him, to confront and possibly, through some miracle, turn the former hero from his path to damnation. It seemed impossible, but Edge felt an irresistible compulsion to make the attempt. Wolfbane had practically preached honor in defending the weak and less fortunate, and now he was ardently opposed to such action. The weak had to be quelled and controlled, made to serve their superiors. If anything, Wolfbane's insurmountable strength had increased since he began his march of conquest. Wolfbane told Edge it was his destiny and right. He little realized, or perhaps he simply did not believe, that Narath was using his skills as a leader to further his own plans. Wolfbane always doubted the potency of the gods. Edge, having grown up in the Temple of One, was wise in their ways. He knew that the ancient feud still raged on among the immortals. Alanormir and Narath, the most powerful of the gods, had long ago been driven apart by their vision of the world of mortals. It was for their pettiness that Wolfbane now fought, whether he understood it or not. The situation could not be so far gone that it could not be reversed. Edge stood up, suddenly awake and energized. There had to be a way to make Wolfbane see that there was no grand reward nor any sudden acceptance and immortality awaiting him for his loyal service to the god of death. Surely some glimmer of his old self lingered inside the man that now ruled with an iron fist. I'll find it, Edge whispered to himself. I have to find it. Leaving behind his chainmail and weapons, Edge threw on his cloak and skeletal clasps and walked quickly out in the corridor. He carefully checked to make sure no one was behind him, then walked down the hall to the servants' quarters where he sought out Lolanas. Edge was unable to find him and began considering where he might have gone, but another worker caught his eye. He was a large man wearing the red and blue livery of Frothgar, working diligently on repairs to a suit of armor. Edge walked over to him. The man kept his eyes on the leather he was patching as he spoke. The Silent One has not returned yet, young master. He scurried off in the opposite direction when he left your quarters. Edge hissed a sharp intake of breath. Are you spying on me, servant? He asked, his tones frosty. The man shook his large head. No, sir. Not built for that type of dishonest work. Just saw him as I was bringing this back from the training rooms. Edge realized the man was quite tall and stocky, the type that would normally be a soldier in one of Wolfbane's elite groups, as the general favored large, powerful men like himself. Edge wondered why this man was reduced to the role of a mere servant. The worker must have understood the reason for the silence because he lifted his right arm up for Edge to see. Hard to fight when you've only got one hand to hold the blade in. I do the best I can. Edge scolded himself for not having noticed the man was using his teeth to pull the thick stitching through the leather, his powers of observation apparently greatly diminished in his work and worry and scheming. Still, Edge had larger problems, such as how he was supposed to get the supplies he wanted to spirit Wolfbane from the fortress. Lolanas was trustworthy enough, but where was he? Knuckling his brows, Edge tried to decide what his next move should be. If it is something you need, I can get it as easily as your quiet servant, my lord, the one-armed man grunted. I have nothing else to be doing today. He looked up at last into Edge's eyes and displayed a worn face with a short but rough graying beard. Edge would have placed him at perhaps 40 years. Just tell me what and where. He provided a quick grin for encouragement. Edge looked at him and finally said, All right, I need supplies for 1 month in packs, plus a set of hunting knives and short swords. Leave them by the north barracks and have it there within 4 hours, all right? The servant nodded and returned to his work. Have it for you on time, my lord. Don't worry yourself over that. Edge nodded once, then a second time more emphatically as he started out of the room. Thank you, servant, he added as he was departing. Not a problem, my lord Edgewolf, not a problem, the man whispered to himself. Chuckling, he returned to his work. Trem braced himself, his hand on the knob, before opening the door of the inn. He had been in many public houses in his time and was used to the noise and chaos of too many people in too little space. However, that had been some time ago, and he was not sure that he was ready to dive back into the fray, especially given the encounter he'd just had in the temple. Stop worrying, he said to no one in particular. No point holding back now. You're stuck in this, and you know it. With that and a deep breath, he opened the door and stepped inside. A slight hint of pipe smoke hit him first, but with it came the distinct smell of old stale meat and roasting meat. Standing next to the entrance, he closed the door and took his time observing the establishment. Directly across from him was the bar with about 20 stools that wrapped from the left wall to take a sharp 90-degree bend into a rather snug corner at the far end of the main room. On the left wall where the bar began were 2 raised corner stages so that the inn could support several entertainers in the common room at once. On the stage side of the room, from left to right, were tables and benches against the wall opposite the bar and kitchens beyond. The stretch of seating led to the far end of the room, which had a blazing fireplace that made the whole space warm but not overly so. The bar bent away from the fireplace, reaching about 10 feet to the back of the inn, and there were 2 small wooden booths currently unoccupied that looked made for more privacy. Excuse me. By now it was evening, cool, trending towards cold, and making the places near the fire more appealing, and as a whole, the year was getting into the mid-fall months. Trim realized he did not even know what month it was, and decided he should ask Joven when the young man was in a less suspicious or concerned mood. The inn's common room was packed, save for the two slightly separated booths, and every chair and stool seemed filled, and there were people standing besides. Many of the patrons appeared to be regulars, sitting in groups and conversing lightly but rather nervously. Others were more easily recognized as outsiders, given their dress and attitude. Most seemed rather quiet, and absorbed in whatever they happened to be drinking or eating. Both stages were occupied, though only one performer was currently amidst his routine. A bard tuned his instrument and waited his turn, while opposite him a young human boy, probably hardly out of his teens, if that, was performing a few illusions and sleights of hand for the benefit of those present. He was dressed in a shoddy and weather-worn robe that, but for the fraying of the cloth, looked almost like one of an authentic wizard. His short black hair was tightly cut round his head, though it was barely visible beneath his large and drooping hood. What was more astounding was the illusionist's partner, a large and brightly flame-colored cat. Standing on its hind legs, the cat was doing its own performance by balancing on its front paws, then on one, then only on its head. On all four of its paws it wore several leather straps with bells attached that jingled with every graceful movement. Having performed its section of the show, the cat returned to its master's side, standing at what Trem guessed was just shy of 7 feet, dwarfing the young man. Currently, the latter was making coins randomly appear from nearby people, only to vanish and suddenly reappear in his hand. Those watching laughed, though the losers of what they thought was their coin began to get a bit testy. The bard, perhaps in an attempt to assist the other performer in winning over the crowd, began playing some background music on his strange six-stringed instrument. As the mood seemed to be getting tenser, the minstrel sidled over and whispered in the boy's ear. Quickly he jumped forward and snatched the last coin out of the air from a grinning, beady-eyed man and pocketed it. The rather fearsome-looking patron growled something, but waited to see what the boy was up to. Trem crossed his arms and leaned against the wall beside the main door to watch. The young man raised his arms that were almost lost amid his warm, mousy-gray sleeves and called out in a clear voice, "Sorry, folks, last trick of the night. But don't worry, my friend here surely has some tales he looks forward to sharing with you." Some people called for more than one last trick, but others simply applauded politely as the bard smiled reassuringly. "All right, then. This one requires some very powerful magic now, so keep your distance, and do not disturb me." The young man then closed his eyes and spread his hands, beginning to chant in a strange sing-song voice, imitating quite well by Trem's memory actual spell chants. Trem's elven blood would have given him a tingling sensation were there true magic in the air, and it remained unaffected by the grandiose verbiage coming from the entertainer. The robed performer's voice rose steadily, till finally he shouted a last word, "Kataz!" and then he froze where he was, arms outstretched. Slowly he brought his arms together, cupping his hands and covering what they held. The audience was leaning forward, straining to see what he was about to reveal. Then he whipped his top hand back and showed nothing more than a common acorn. The people watching exploded. Some laughed, thinking it was a joke. Others yelled their complaints, but the young man was not done yet. He held up his free hand for silence, and moments later it was restored. Winking, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Of course, that's not the whole trick." A few people laughed, but most remained silent, waiting for the big surprise that was coming. Holding the acorn in the palm of his hand, the boy extended it out as far as he could and whispered a word under his breath, hardly moving his lips at all, so that Trem was certain only he had noticed. Suddenly he felt a tingling in his hands, and it rapidly shot up his arms, and soon he could feel a dull hum throughout his whole body. The acorn suddenly split open, and a griffin, half lion and half eagle, steadily growing, crawled out of it. When it reached the size of a small dog, it leapt from the boy's hand and flew around the inn's common room several times, causing people to duck their heads and cry in surprise. The griffin flew by once more and then alighted on a table, where it suddenly shriveled up into an acorn again. There was a period of dead silence while the man at the table picked up the acorn, turned it cautiously in his hands, and then replaced it where the creature had landed. Trem feared the boy might have overplayed his hand, for surely those there would realize it was no simple parlor trick he had performed, and some might react out of fear with violence. But then the room erupted in applause, and as the young man strode to the table, grinning at the shocked acorn examiner, while he received many hearty claps in the back from several patrons. One of the most incensed clappers near the bar, Trem recognized as Jovanaleth. Taking his hand off the hilt of his sword, unaware he'd reached for it until that moment, Trem watched as the boy retrieved his acorn and slipped it into his robes. He had performed a very real and very powerful illusion, a spell he should not have been capable of reading at his young age without having his eyes burned out of his sockets. Yet he had cast it, well enough to fool even Trem but for his elven heritage. His respect and wariness of the boy grew. Trem was not the only one who was intrigued by the display, and not all the audience were so amused. The man who had lost the last trick coin stood up, blocking the boy's path to the corner at the far end of the bar. Leering down at him through bleary eyes, perhaps a bit clouded by the establishment's ale, the man stood as straight as his tipsy legs allowed. The rest of the common room, aside from the man's cronies, was now focused on the minstrel reciting a love story to the occasional twangs of his instrument. The boy looked right back at his intimidator, betraying no emotion. In his mind, Trem urged the illusionist not to do anything rash. The man growled at the boy. "You're going to be giving me that coin, son, else there'll be trouble. I know you're kind of their tricks. Killed plenty in my time." The boy simply stared back, unmoving, but his cat had paused in the stowing of their equipment into a large leather pack. It was staring frozen at its master and his confronter. The man grabbed the boy by his front robes, lifting him off his feet, and bellowed, "Are you deaf, boy? I said give me my money." In a flash, the cat was between the two, holding a long sword to the man's throat and a dagger to the temple of his closest friend, who had started to draw his club. Trem noted the long, finger-like paws of the cat creature and how they seemed to envelop the entirety of the handle and hilt of his sword and dagger, but the others were more interested in the standoff. The youth stared at the man, whose chin was nearly perpendicular to the ceiling, with terrified eyes angled down at the boy still clutched in his fist. "Put me down, and I will tell Neep to let you go," the young wizard said with exquisite calm. The man instantly dropped the boy and ran out of the inn, followed by his companions. The sword and dagger immediately disappeared into sheaths at the cat's back and leg, respectively. The cat retrieved the pack it had been stowing their gear in and, with its eyes following only its master, walked to one of the corner booths and sat down, its tail poking through the back of the bench and swishing just off the dirty floor. Trem watched the inn return to its normal noisy self. The silence that had been complete once the man grabbed the magician shattered, and the minstrel took up his tale with a light joke that erased the tension. The bartender for the evening, a rather large and wide woman, came and spoke to the two unusual performers, smiling genuinely and bringing them some stew from the kitchen. The boy thanked her, and the two started a quiet meal. Deciding he had observed all he needed to, Trem turned to find Joven crossing the room. He had a rather grim look on his face as he commented, "Glad the cat took care of the drunk. He looked dangerous." Trem smiled, and the two walked toward the corner of the bar where they sat on neighboring stools. "The stew should be safe," Trem commented. "The cook is fat. It means she must eat well." Joven laughed out loud and called the woman over. Before she arrived, Trem added, almost as an afterthought, "You were wrong about the drunk. He was harmless." Joven looked at him curiously, and Trem returned the look, now quite serious. "It's the boy who's the real danger. He's a mage." That's chapter 4. I need a minute. Alright, chapter 5. Edgewolf Elvok walked out of the servants' quarters and paused, considering what to do next. It would be easiest to abscond with Wolfbane as close as possible to the time when Edge's supplies would be in place. Thankfully, this gave him a few spare moments to make other preparations. Walking back to his rooms, he retrieved his armor and tunic, tossing his hooded black cloak on in place of the silken one he'd been wearing, carefully swapping out the clasps as he did. Taking his large halberd from its corner in the wall, he examined its blade and spearhead. The weapon was a foot taller than Edge, well over 6.5 feet from haft to fearsome spiked tip. The spearhead was a diamond shape and had a large axe head just below it. The concave axe blade was curved in two places, making a central flaring point with two more sharp tips at the top and base. This gave it a rather large, serrated look, as though it would have been part of an immense knife. The haft was of black ironwood from the Forester woodlands in Silverleaf. Edge had made the weapon himself upon arrival at Nepal City, a means of distraction from the somber spectacle of the fallen city. It was now his most prized possession. Using it like an oversized walking stick, he walked out of his room, with the hood pulled down over his face. Once back in the hall, he checked both left and right and went down the passage opposite the servants' rooms he had visited earlier, heading past other high-ranking officers' rooms, including those of Velissa and Frothgar. At the end of the hall, he turned left from the commander's private smithy room, where his halberd had been forged. A large double door stood before him, and he opened it, entering the courtyard of Castle Bane. The yard was vast, and there was no shortage of activity within it. The entire space was surrounded by a 10-foot wall with tightly placed ramparts, topped with spikes that curved from their tops down to the wall's outer edge to prevent scaling. Solid gray granite, a foot thick, made these impressive bastions of defense. Frothgar's personal guard, trained as expert archers, were atop the walls, spaced about every 3 feet and armed with daggers and crossbows. The only way in, barring coming over the walls, was the massive main gate made of 2 8-foot-high ironwood doors backed by 2 equally immense black steel portcullises. Flanking the entire entrance were 2 4-story stone towers with murder holes facing inward so as to protect the entrance. Within each of the towers were the mechanisms for one of the portcullis gates. Thus, in order to control the entrance to the fortress, one had to hold both towers. Even in such an event, there was an interior fortress with 4 towers, the largest rising some 20 stories high, 15 more than the other 3 attached to the inner castle. The highest tower used by Wolfbane for council meetings and his personal chambers had been constructed by Kundran Dolg, also known as the Mad Thane. Most subsequent rulers of Nepal City had considered it an eyesore, but Wolfbane had thought otherwise and claimed it as a way to assert his authority and power. After all, demanding his council climb the great number of steps to its peak for any meeting assured they remembered who was in command. The rest of the castle was taken up mostly by the large empty hall, but there was also a gigantic kitchen occupying a decent portion of the ground floor and a vast expanse of dungeons beneath it. The other floors above the main hall contained several substantial libraries and a few small storage areas or cluttered bedrooms. The dungeons were Deirvron's almost exclusively. The kitchen supplied the entire complement of the fortress defenders with their rations, and the libraries were strictly for the use of the two mages who had the entire authority over the fortress, excepting Wolfbane's tower. At its very top, which Edge had just left over an hour ago, was where Wolfbane kept his private items and spent the majority of his time, often not coming down even to sleep in his more practically positioned bedroom, located on the third. On the interior of all the outside walls, excepting the location of the gate, were barracks north, east, and west. The western end also held the officers' living quarters, and was where Edge was currently standing. In front of the castle, Belissa was drilling her fighters in several sword forms. Despite his total dislike for the unscrupulous woman, Edge respected her skills of the blade. Often those who rose quickly in her ranks of trainees would be forced to fight her. Those that could last more than 5 minutes were entered into the elite troop commanded by Belissa herself. Most did not make it more than 30 seconds without being disarmed or seriously wounded, and Belissa offered no apology for her brutal methods. To the north of the castle stood a few Nerathian soldiers practicing with ranged weapons against tattered, vaguely humanoid targets. Few remained out in the darkening light, but those that did were opposite Edge's path, firing arrows or hucking axes and conversing casually with one another. Edge strode out and into the narrow gap between the two of the barrack bunk rooms. Following the darkened pathway, he moved north until he was facing the main wall. Keeping it to his left, he turned right, and walked until he stood outside a small cottage shielded from the rest of the fortress by the surrounding barracks. He knocked quietly, checking over his shoulder to see if anyone was with him in the alley. The door opened a crack, revealing a shimmering firelight from within. A tentative, almost musical voice said, "Yes, who is it?" Edge smiled in spite of himself and replied, "It's Edge, Raymir. Can I come in?" The door swung open. "Of course you can." Edge set his halberd outside and stepped into a comfortable one-room cottage with a blazing fire, a small cot, and 2 chairs with an uneven and unmatched table. Edge picked up one of the chairs and set it in front of the fire, warming his hands as his companion brought over her own seat to join him. For some time they merely sat there, letting the heat of the fire wash over them. Edge looked over at Raymir while she was staring into the flames, enjoying the features of her face. Raymir had unusually bright red hair that hung several inches past her shoulders. Her small nose was set under 2 bright green eyes that he sometimes swore were just like his own. She had high cheekbones and an intoxicating smile, completed by small dimples. In short, she was the most beautiful person in the world, by Edge's account. He came to see her at least 3 times a week whenever his responsibilities left him free. Raymir worked in the castle libraries, documenting and sorting the various books for the 2 mages. More often than not, she was released earlier than other servants and treated well, for it was known where she served in the army. Some suspected her to be an illusion, for surely no mage needed a woman to assist him, but Edge knew she was very real. Looking at her, he suddenly noticed a small lump on her forehead, partially hidden by her red hair. He reached out to brush it back, making her meet his gaze. He paused a second before asking, "How did you get this?" Raymir blushed. "It was Saltillion. He found me looking at a book I should not have. It's all right. I'm fine. I told him I was just looking at the pictures, and he believed me." Raymir grimaced. He still leers at me when he thinks I don't see him. After he saw the bruise, he apologized and tried to heal it for me, but I would not let him. I don't want his magic touching my skin. She shuddered slightly, and Edge cupped her head in his hands, moving the bruise into the light. "I can put a poultice on it now, and it won't take long." She protested, though not much, as he applied a small weaving of leaves, along with a few drops of a concoction he had stowed in his gear, brought from the castle. He did not tell her that Saltillion had probably made the medicine, knowing he would never get her to accept his help in that case. She held it to her forehead while smiling at him, and he grinned back before taking a deep breath and reaching for her hand. Holding it in his, he moved her fingers in front of his face, while keeping his eyes down. Concerned, Raymir tried to bring his eyes upward. "What is it, Edge? Something's wrong." He looked up, now smiling, and ran his hand through her hair. "No, love, everything is fine. I've just made up my mind, that's all. We are leaving, if you still have that escape tunnel you told me about." She nodded, trying to contain her excitement. "Have you tested it?" he asked. "No, I would not go through with truly leaving until you decided to come with me." She grimaced slightly. "My father showed it to me once, and we still served our people in the castle. At least he did one noble thing in life, even if it was unintentional." Edge sighed. Raymir's father, Greymane Squall, had betrayed his people in the hope that his family would be spared. In the end, only he and Raymir survived, Wolfbane and Caermon's violent retribution for his traitorous bargain. Raymer was forced to watch her siblings killed and her mother waste away in the dungeons of the fortress, while her father made a seemingly impossible escape. Raymer blamed her father for everything. Edge blamed Wolfbane's blind corruption. Well, if you are sure we can go tonight, then we will go tonight. I have a pack with some food and anything else you need, warm clothes, that sort of thing. We have to travel lightly, though, or we will not get far. My things will be here in a few hours. A servant is bringing them, and he'll leave them outside. Once he leaves, bring them in here. I will come by a little later with Wolfbane. Wolfbane? She asked him, not sounding angry or shocked, but more skeptical. Are you sure he will come? I know he's your friend and a father to you, Edge, but you have to realize he's different from the man you knew. Her voice trailed off. She was clearly very worried and looked at him imploringly. Edge stood and put his cloak back on, turning to her, his face grim. I have to try at least, Raymer, and even if he won't come, I doubt he would hunt me down. Our friendship still runs that deep. It has to. She stood and walked to him, hugging him suddenly and fiercely. He held her for a few glorious moments, and then she stepped back, with tears in her eyes. Just be sure you come safely, please. I promise to be ready. I will, love, I swear. Remember, just a few hours, waste no time. And having spoken his piece, Edge kissed her hand lightly and turned, sweeping quietly out the door, and into what was now becoming a rainy evening. Raymer stood at her lone window and watched him walk down the alley and turn left away from the wall. She crossed her arms and looked at the floor, taking a deep breath. Raymer had lived so many hard days since the fall of her nation that she had lost count, or chosen not to attempt keeping track. Her pursuit of magic and knowledge within the library had sustained her and given her purpose, but then Edge had come along, and once again she felt she had something to lose. She looked out the window into the soft rain now falling more and more steadily outside and whispered, just let him come back. Please let him come back. Perhaps if he'd had any idea how worried Raymer was, Edge never would have left her home. As it was, he was more interested in rescuing Wolfbane from his misguided reign and bringing him freely out of the darkness to a new life, one that would be more like the old days of heroism and virtue. His step was lighter both from these thoughts and knowing that no matter what happened with Wolfbane, he would still leave the woman he loved, and perhaps find some place, any place, to ride out the storm of war. In truth, Edge felt he had already seen enough of battle and was ready for a quiet life in relative seclusion. Through the rain now pelting down on his head, the stealthy warrior walked, eyes down to conceal himself and to keep out the wetness. Even in his heavy cloak, he felt the cold seeping into him slowly, making him shiver. He chanced to glance upward and saw the towers of the castle in his wet eyes. Nearly there, he sped up a bit, holding his halberd halfway up the pole and off the ground, trotting for the archway of the castle gates. 2 guards were huddled in the entrance, but they ignored him. Anyone who came to the castle was permitted entry without question until they reached the 3rd floor, where Sultana and Darevron had set a few wards to detect intruders within their domain. Edge knew from Raymer that there was a servant's stair leading to the northwest tower's giant spiral staircase, which was not warded. Dodging left halfway through the main entrance hall, lit by several immense flaming braziers, Edge entered the kitchen. Already the cooks were preparing the next day's meals, and no one paid him much heed, except to step aside when he came forward. No servant dared challenge an armed man in Wolfbane's fortress. At the far end of the kitchen was a door that appeared to lead to a storage room. Edge used his halberd to pry it open and check for occupants. It was pitch black within, so he borrowed a thin torch from the kitchen and slipped back behind the door. Once inside, he turned to see a small stair leading up to the 2nd floor, complete with another door. He went up and passed it, following the next flight beyond the first landing until he reached the 3rd floor that had no door to the library, hence the lack of magical wards. He took the last staircase, which ended in an apparent blank wall. Feeling the wall to his right, he pulled the loose brick out and watched the false wall slide aside, opening up to the foyer to Wolfbane's tower stairs. After checking left and right for any presence, he started the long trek up the spiraling staircase. The entire walk over 600 stairs carried one to a dizzying height only after a tiring climb. So flushed with hope and exuberance was Edge that it took him a far shorter time to reach the top than any of his previous ascents. He paused, catching his breath, and straightened his cloak so as not to look disheveled before the commander. Edge did not want to appear runaway, or Wolfbane might not even take the time to listen. With a final nod to reassure himself, he opened the door by pressing another false stone in the wall. The large meeting room spread out before him, adorned with its massive table and many shield and weapon displays from fallen enemies. Strangely, it was sparsely lit, and only a wavering torchlight shone on the far hall where Wolfbane's makeshift bedchamber was. Edge was surprised that the warrior was sleeping already. He had anticipated finding him in the study poring over his maps, but the hall end lights were out. Moving quietly toward the back so as not to startle Wolfbane, he reached the doorway and called out, not loudly but too aggressively. If he skulked around, Wolfbane might mistake him for an assassin, and he would be dead in seconds. My lord, Wolfbane, please, I need to speak with you urgently. There was no response, so cautiously Edge stepped into the room. Wolfbane had ordered a large mat and several plush pillows moved into one of the smaller rooms along with several hanging curtains to give the sleeping area more of a bedroom look. A large assortment of sweet-smelling candles lit the room faintly, explaining the shimmering light Edge had seen earlier. Wolfbane was slumped on his stomach, breathing extremely slowly and heavily, apparently in a very deep sleep. Edge leaned in close and tried to nudge him awake, but there was no response. He had known Wolfbane as a light sleeper. Surely he would have awakened before Edge could have even touched him. Ah, the young fool is here after all. How perfectly predictable. Edge whirled around, holding his halberd in front of him. D'Arveron materialized out of the gloom from the hall, his loose, hanging, and dislocated jaw showing under the thin silk wrap over his face. Edge would have sworn he was smiling, but was not sure that was possible. D'Arveron walked to within reach of Edge's weapon, clearly unperturbed by its presence. The mage shook his fingers sardonically at him. It's not wise to be wandering after dark. One might almost think you were up to something. He laughed, and it sounded like a pit of snakes. Do you honestly believe no one would find out? I have eyes and ears everywhere. Your elven servant happens to be one of my favorites. They are so much more useful once you remove the tongue. What have you done to Wolfbane? Edge growled. D'Arveron shook his head dismissively as he answered. No need to be concerned about him. I merely gave him a sleeping draught. I convinced him that rest would give him the ability to think clearly. Fortunately, he's too bullheaded to ever become truly clear-minded, even when well rested. That shimmer of cloth betrayed another almost smile, and D'Arveron sighed. Ah well, he's no longer your concern. You will not be taking him anywhere. I need him still, for now. As to you, troublesome whelp, your escape ends here, tonight, and shortly thereafter, she will be joining you. He laughed loudly at the anger contorting Edge's face. You leave her out of this. She's done nothing wrong. True, remarked D'Arveron thoughtfully, but you'll suffer so much more knowing you are the reason she died. Goodbye, fool. Before Edge could react, D'Arveron called out and shoved his hands toward him. Edge flew backwards, striking the wall a few feet behind him and dropping his halberd. He clenched his teeth in pain and tried to clear his head. His weapon was useless against the undead fiend's magic, but he had to save Raymir. D'Arveron advanced, already chanting the spell that would snuff out his victim's life. Edge looked around wildly and spotted his halberd lying next to his foot. Without thinking, he brought the toe of his boot under its axe blade and kicked up, hard. Throwing his weight forward, he slammed his shoulder into D'Arveron's, breaking the surprised wizard's concentration. Catching his weapon as he struck the withered spellcaster, Edge swung it hard and low, taking out his enemy's legs with the haft. Rushing forward, past the sprawling form, he sped toward the stairs. D'Arveron roared his unearthly fury after the retreating man and regained his footing. Rising swiftly, he hurried after his quarry and saw him duck behind the door to the stairs. Elgato, the mage commanded, and the door swung open so forcefully it shattered on the stone wall where it struck. Stalking to the doorway, D'Arveron raised his hands and started chanting, his voice now surprisingly clear and terrifyingly free of its usual dry crackle. Ascatins Lomanots and Vatis del Kaloth. Edge was running and leaping rapidly down the stairs, careening off the wall when necessary, and was almost at the bottom when he heard the mage finish his chant. Instinctively he dove, rolling down the last 20 or so stairs and slamming into the floor, splayed out, knocking the wind from his lungs. A searing orb of heat hurled around the corner he had just tumbled down and smashed into the secret entrance he'd come from, blasting the stone to bits and cutting his hands and face. Regaining his feet, Edge thrust down the stairs to the bottom floor, shoving his way through the kitchen and out of the keep doors. The guards on watch stared at him as he burst forth, but did not attempt to stop him. Edge paused, trying to reorient himself now that he was outside. All he could think of was that he had to reach Raymir immediately. Suddenly a figure appeared in one of the third-floor windows in the keep. D'Arveron spat at the guards in rage. Get him, you fools! Kill him! Unquestioningly, the guards hefted their spears and positioned their shields to protect their bodies. Quickly they circled Edge, cutting off escape on both sides of the keep. Their reach would prevent him from simply running past, and returning to the keep would mean certain death. Edge turned to face the guard to his right. The man readied himself and started pressing in with his longer-reaching weapon. Edge backed up slowly, being sure not to check over his shoulder at his other opponent. Keeping his eyes on the other man's face, he saw him glance behind Edge's shoulder meaningfully, and reacted instantly. Spinning, he ducked low under the thrust that would have taken him through the back, and stepped forward, swinging the heavy balancing spike of his halberd behind him. He caught the thrusting guard squarely between his shoulders and broke his spine with a sickening crunch. The guard grunted and gasped, stumbling into his partner, who was slowed by the dying man's weight pressed into his shield. Without glancing back, Edge had already started running and was now heading north along the eastern wall of the castle. Speeding through the archery range, now thankfully abandoned by any lingering soldiers, Edge hurried down the narrow alley toward Raymir's cottage. Suddenly a figure rose up in front of him, just outside her door, and without thinking, Edge drove his blunt pole end into the shadow's gut and grabbed its shirt collar, pressing the intruder up against the wall of the cottage. Where is she? Damn it, tell me where she is. Edge, stop. I'm here. I'm right here. Raymer stood poised in her doorway, holding a lantern, which shone on his face. Edge, you're hurt. Quick, get inside. But Edge used the light to examine the trespasser, immediately dropping him upon seeing his face. It was the one-armed servant from before. Bending over to catch his breath, he held up a large and full pack. Beg your pardon, my lord. I was not trying to skulk. You just said to bring these quickly and quietly, so I did. Edge stepped back and helped the man straighten. I'm sorry. We have to leave right now, Raymer. You too, he gestured towards the servant. We're all in grave danger. D'Evrons was waiting for me, Raymer. He drugged Wolfbane so I could not even talk to him. He knew my whole plan. He knew about you. I was afraid. Suddenly she was hugging him tightly and sobbing into his shoulder. Edge embraced her just as tightly and squeezed his eyes shut. His fear, his pain at having thought she was dead had passed. The servant coughed, hefting the pack he had just brought. Edge and Raymer separated, Raymer blushing and pretending to be fixing her hair, though she was still crying a little. Edge looked at the older man. He met his gaze with surprising ferocity and said, If you know a quick way out of here, my lord, I suggest we take it immediately. The guards will be here soon. Raymer composed herself and straightened. He's right, she said, looking at Edge. We have to get away first. Come on. Once we are in the tunnel and I seal it off, they cannot get to us. No one knows where it comes out. The three hurried into the cottage and stood before the fireplace. Raymer whispered a few words and the blaze winked out immediately, leaving them with only the lantern. The servant grunted and Edge looked at Raymer wide-eyed. She grinned mischievously. You didn't think I spent all that time in the library without learning something. Edge shook his head in awe as Raymer lifted an iron hinge from under the ashes and threw it back. She winced as she did so. I'm afraid I burnt my hand. Forgot magic fire is still fire. Without another word, she dropped into the tunnel, followed by Edge, and then the one-armed man. Urging them forward, she returned to the entrance, taking what looked like a string between her fingers. She whispered some words, and suddenly it began burning. Edge saw at the other end was a small barrel, filled to overflowing with a strange black powder. Raymer hurried up to them, grabbing the two men and shoving them forward. What are you waiting for? Run! The three sped down the tunnel, ducking to keep from scraping their heads on the low roof. Moments later, there was a resounding explosion behind them, and the shockwave knocked them all flat. Rising quickly from the dust, Raymer pulled the other two up with surprising strength. It's just a few more yards. Hurry. Running forward quickly, the three suddenly shot out of the hole and into a large open cavern with a small spring running out of its walls and flowing down a gentle slope. The moonlight lit the cavern from a small opening in the roof. Edge and the others hit the stone hard as the tunnel caved in behind them. Looking at Raymer, Edge grinned. They were safe from pursuit at last. She smiled back, and then suddenly leapt up, her face a mask of fear and shock. Edge started to rise when a firm hand grabbed him around the neck, the other holding a dagger blade to his throat. Don't move now, miss. I'm not going to hurt him if you stay still, but he's not someone I can let run wild. He was in league with Wolfbane. I can't just let him run free. Edge's chin was pointed to the sky, but his green eyes burned with hatred at the face over his shoulder. The worn and bearded visage leaned forward to grin knowingly at Edge from behind two good hands. How had he gotten his arm back? Edge wondered. The grin quickly turned sad as the hand with the dagger came up. Sorry, lad. I liked you. I really did. But you're just too dangerous to trust. The dagger came down, Raymer screamed, and everything went black. Alright, that's chapter 5. This brings us to 6. About 100 pages in, 400 or so to go. So, I'm going to be... Oh, hey, White. Yeah, repping Croatia for sure. I'm going to be out of town for the next 3 days visiting some family, so I am not going to be available to do readings or any of the live streaming stuff. But I will pick it back up on Monday. We'll be on chapter 6 from The Sword. And I'll look ahead too and see if there's any other chances where I can read multiple sessions at once, or multiple chapters in one session rather, and therefore get us a little further ahead. So, everything will be available on YouTube. I'm going to upload it tonight, so you'll be able to get everything through Chapter 5 on YouTube. Currently, it is the prologue. Chapters 1, 2, and 3 are up. 4 and 5 will go up today. Maybe it's only the prologue 1 and 2. If so, everything I just said will still be up. So you can find that on YouTube if you search for Trevor H. Paul. I'm going to add that link to the Twitch page right after I end this stream. Last thing is, of course, follow this on @LegacyChronicle Twitter, where I usually let people know when I'm going to be doing a live stream. And finally, you can buy the books, and that's what they look like. They're thick, they're big, they come with maps. On Amazon, if you search for T.H. Paul, The Legacy Chronicle, and there are 2 books available right now, The Sword and The Shield. Each is about 500 pages. Paperbacks are $20 if you have a Kindle. You can get them each for $6. If you have Kindle Unlimited, they're free, and it still helps me out. So, thanks for watching. White, thanks for tuning in, as always, and I will be back on Monday.